Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here. You guys know what time it is. Time to talk about current events in the online fitness community. And for those of you who like these type of videos, please remember to click like down below. It would be greatly appreciated. But a number of people have awared me that Frankie, the Italian stallion Tufano, has made a video saying you don't need to bench press. That's where I'm going to disagree with Frankie. And I actually like Frankie, so I'm going to be very, very gentle in this one. And the reason I say that is because I actually appreciate Frankie's nutrition stance. I actually appreciate the keto stuff. A lot of people don't know that because I don't always talk about nutrition very often here, but I do follow a very meat-heavy ketogenic diet personally. That's what I choose to do. I'm not saying it's the best approach for you personally, because diets depend upon individual adherence, satiety, inflammation, how you handle foods. There's a lot of factors as far as what an ideal diet is for a person, but generally speaking, for body composition purposes, usually your calories and your protein are your two most important factors, and there's a whole host of other things, right? These are very individual things, and so I want people to understand that when I follow that dietary approach, it doesn't mean that I think that it is the only way or the right way for you personally. So just keep that in mind. So that being said, I actually do appreciate the stance he takes there. All right, so I want to get that out of the way up front, and when I'm going to be critical of what he's saying with the training, because I know the training isn't really his main wheelhouse, it's the nutrition stuff, and I actually like a lot of what he does. And I like Frankie. I actually like him as a YouTuber. So that being said, I felt that there's a need to correct him on some of this, and let's come over to the point. Frankie essentially said we don't need to bench press, it doesn't work the pecs that well the way most guys do it, but here's what we need to look at. When we're talking training information, because a few gym bros do something a certain way, and maybe it isn't ideal, doesn't mean that we completely disregard other effective methods. Because he said, usually a lot of guys come in and they just kind of ramp up to like a 1 rep max on a bench, and they're lifting really, really heavy and with bad form and ego lifting. Well, yeah, if that's all you did for your chest and that was considered to be your bench training, then I would agree that actually isn't ideal. But the bench press itself is a phenomenal upper body builder, not just a chest builder. And the thing that we have to consider is that the bench press performed correctly is perfectly safe exercise. Perfectly safe exercise. Now, do a lot of people perform the bench press incorrectly? Of course they do. Do a lot of guys perform the bench press in a haphazard manner? Of course they do. But that's not the exercise's fault. Learn how to train, guys. Learn how to bench. Learn how to get tight. Learn to pause. One of the things he pointed out is that it can be hard on the shoulders. Well, but flies are just as hard on the shoulders. He kind of said, well, you want to take your delts out of it and just focus on the chest. Well, any of those fly exercises to where you are working your chest, you're working your front delts just as much still. All right, you're not going to remove the anterior deltoid from the pectorals. And as far as talking about things like the lateral direction the fibers run, a mild arch in the bench press, instead of being flat back, does the same thing you're talking about doing as far as getting those fibers the way they run across the chest. The bench press is actually an extremely good pectoral recruiter when done correctly. It just has the added benefit of adding a lot of muscle to the rest of your upper body. Okay, just because the triceps are being used doesn't mean it doesn't put a lot of meat on your pecs, and it actually does, and it's a very effective, very efficient upper body exercise that just happens to be pectoral dominant, and it is. And usually, ironically, the people who claim that the bench press isn't usually a good chest builder are usually the guys who do the most gear, guys who use the most bro training, the guys who basically put enough stuff into their body, again, bodybuilders, that it probably doesn't really matter that much what exercises they do as long as they get a pump. They're probably going to grow. As long as they're training hard and they get a pump, they're going to get big. Okay, that doesn't really matter what they pick. They're the ones who have the biggest problem with it. Ironically, Frankie is using mostly their training methods. He's saying, look, we need to focus upon continual tension, lightweight, really high reps, 15 to 20 reps, short breaks. All right, the metabolic type training like that, I'm not saying it doesn't have its place. It does have its place. Okay, it does have its place even for hypertrophy work, but that is absolutely not going to be the foundation of your training. You're not going to get particularly big or particularly strong doing that, and what people need to understand, those are correlated. And yes, I come at this from the direction of a strength athlete. Right? I do come at this from the direction of a strength athlete, but the reality is for people who are natural. People who are natural, people who are not genetic freaks, there is an enormous correlation with size and strength. You are going to have to get incredibly strong if you want to get really big. Okay? That's just the reality of it. There is an enormous overlap between size and strength. And it's not to say that some of the more hypertrophy specific training doesn't help you both directions, because it does. But when you start talking about this deep metabolic fatigue training like what Frankie's talking about, that usually is not ideal for any sort of prolonged muscle growth, right? That's the sort of stuff that you might want to consider doing after the real work. Again, if you need more training volume, you're in a phase of training where you need all that extra metabolic work and metabolic fatigue to stimulate new muscle growth through the extra training volume. You know, some of that has its place and it can be beneficial in that environment. But it is not the most effective for primary training. Big movements, heavy movements, moderately heavy movements are the way to go. And I'm not saying only doing singles. Even me, I do 2 different bench workouts every week, right? Even as a power lifter, I have a max effort day and I have a dynamic effort day. Well, my dynamic day actually is 9 sets of 5 for speed with lightweight. But a lot of times I do volume work on my max day. So I might do a heavy, build up to a heavy max, right? We do heavy max with a variation, but a lot of my back off work could be 6, 8, 10 reps. With bench press, bench variations, floor presses, things like that. You know, and all of that does work because you get additional training volume with that. And so it all works together as far as getting the maximum stimulation from going heavy, combining it with volume work. But, you know, chest pressing should generally be the foundation of your chest training, irrespective of what your goals are. I don't really care specifically what all you're training for. If you're trying to get bigger and more jacked in general, which is actually a goal of power lifters and strength athletes also. People forget that. We are trying to get big. We are trying to maximize hypertrophy. It is part of what we do. It's necessary for what we do. So this all has its place, but at the end of the day, you need to focus generally on moderately heavy weights, up to very heavy weight, but at least moderately heavy weights on big compound movements as your primary training. Other things like this fall under the category of secondary stress, and it's not because they cause more muscle fiber recruitment in the pectorals. It's not because they don't. That's not actually the case. The problem becomes you can only handle sometimes so much total volume on your big exercises before it does start to accumulate wear, extra fatigue, things that you can't recover from. Sometimes we need to use smaller exercises like this in order to stimulate additional workload in a lagging area because we can't add 5 more sets of bench press. We can't recover from 5 more sets of bench press or weighted dips or something else, right? We can't recover from it in a given week, and so we might need to, if that area, that particular muscle still needs additional work because it's lagging behind or it has additional individual recovery, but your triceps or shoulders or whatever don't, it becomes useful to add that work in, right? It has its place as a secondary stimulus, right? As a secondary stimulus. You know, and he kind of brought up the point of, well, and in all these flies, they don't bring the triceps and your triceps don't become a limiting factor. Well, triceps are sometimes a limiting factor on your max bench as far as the max poundages you can use, but generally not in terms of hypertrophy. In other words, when you look at any of the data at various chest presses, including the flat bench, usually your pecs are still a larger recruiter in there than your triceps are. They actually play a larger role. It's unlikely that your triceps are going to be the absolute limiting factor. And usually for people who are chasing a big bench, what we find is that we need additional tricep work. Right? If anything, you find most people who are chasing big bench, they don't get enough tricep stimulation from their bench press. In other words, because we know that even though the triceps are a close secondary muscle, very close secondary muscle behind the pecs on a chest press, if they get bigger, we can usually still lift more weight because they're still involved. We can again recruit more, we can get a better lockout, things like that. There's a lot of reasons to beef your triceps up. So more often than not, you're going to find a lot of power lifters actually do more tricep work because our chest gets plenty of stimulation from all the benching. And very rarely do you see any jacked power lifters who have a big bench who do not have a massive chest. It just tends to go hand in hand with it. The bench press has always been a phenomenal chest builder. It has always been, will always be. The only people who don't feel that it is, again, are generally people who don't perform it correctly. Maybe they don't touch their chest, they don't pause on the chest, they don't go into scapular retraction. Right? There's a lot of factors at play, but usually if you don't feel your chest working deeply on a bench press, you're probably really loose. You don't have the scapula retracted correctly down. down and back, you don't have a slight arch. And if you do that and you get tight and you come down to your chest and press, it's going to be a completely different animal. If you don't normally feel your pecs and you just feel like your front delts on the bench press, that correction will usually fix it. Go try that, and I think guys are going to find, oh wow, he's right, this really is a serious chest exercise. And again, it's just poor execution of the lift that's the issue. And at the end of the day, here's what I would say. If you feel that you need additional chest work after that, then by all means put some in if it works in with your training programming. But the majority of guys out there can generally build a pretty big chest off of pressing by itself, along with getting the added benefits of other muscles growing. And like I said, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying flies and things don't have their place, but for most lifters, they're actually not necessary. Most guys are going to be able to get everything that they want out of benching. And flies are not safer than the bench. Usually accidents happen on the bench press because people potato press, bounce it off their chest. They don't train correctly. They bench too high up here on the chest instead of a little bit of tuck and keeping it below the nipple line, causing, again, internal rotation of the shoulder. They have weak rear delt, weak muscles in their upper back. Things like that are what contribute. But that's a muscle weakness issue and a technique issue. It's not really the fault of the bench press. Or they just flat bench way too wide. Keep your pinkies inside the rings. Keep your scapula retracted, touch to the lower chest, and you are very unlikely to have those issues. And quite frankly, a lot of flies, if you do those things, it's actually going to be safer on your shoulder joints and everything else usually than flies are. At that point, a lot of times fly type exercises can become more dangerous, right? And I mean, of course, Frankie threw in the added bonus in there of saying that he likes to do the cable crossovers because he said, and I quote, because then you can bend over and have your glutes pointed at a whole room full of sweaty men. But you know that what? You can do that after you get done bench pressing. You don't actually have to do that on the cable fly. You can just do that on your own, man. You don't have to go to the cable fly to do that. You can get up and do that after you stand up off the bench if you want to, if that's your goal, right? It's not really a problem. You don't have to do that with your exercise selection. So all in all, what I have to say on this, I'm going to completely disagree with Frankie on this. I'm going to correct him. I'm going to advise him to actually work on his bench press. He'll get a lot bigger and thicker overall. Work on his overall strength. And that would be the advice I give to him. And again, I'm going to be nice about it because I actually do like Frankie and I like what he does for the most part. I just think in this particular video, as people sent it to me and pointed it out to me, that he is just flat wrong on this one. All right, guys, well, that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.